The G-class of destroyers were a class built for the Royal Navy in the 1930s, with a number of subclasses like the H-class and Haven classes. Most would serve in the Royal Navy and Commonwealth navies, but some would be sold as exports. With the 1930 London Naval Treaty still in force, it would be vital to save tonnage on each ship of the class, being able to reduce the size and weight of these destroyers from previous interwar designs. The 1933 design began as a repeat of the 1932 ships, in the sense that the armament followed a similar line that most British interwar destroyers, with four single 4.7-inch mounts with two superfiring forward and two superfiring aft, along with torpedo launchers just behind the funnel, with depth charges and a light anti-aircraft battery. However, with the G-class, a new 5.1-inch gun was being considered. If it proved to be successful in testing, it could be placed on new 40-degree mounts, but they did not prove successful, and even if they were, it would have been difficult to incorporate them on the 1933 design. Along with both the CNC of the Home Fleet and his Commodore recommending the 4.7-inch gun over the 5.1-inch gun, arguing that the rate of fire was more important than the shell weight. Another interesting development for this class is that in October of 1932, there was a thought of replacing the quadruple torpedo tubes found on previous classes with a quintuple torpedo frame. Torpedo batteries were becoming more and more prominent, as in the previous several years, new methods of firing were proposed and tested, notably by the 3rd Destroyer Flotilla of the Mediterranean Fleet in May of 1932, where they would have a series of exercises designed to find the best way to fire full salvos to cover freely maneuvering enemies. I think an excerpt from British destroyers from earliest days to the Second World War by Norman Freeman will explain it a lot better than I will be able to. 4 destroyers fired full 8 torpedo salvos at an enemy line represented by 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers. On a very dark night, they made contact just as the leading ship altered course. Firing range varied between 1,000 and 600 yards. This was thought to be the first full divisional night destroyer torpedo attack using all torpedoes. The Rear Admiral considered it vital for destroyers to fire full salvos in such trials to avoid false conclusions. Alternate destroyers staggered their shots to avoid collisions between them. They succeeded even though they were firing at the same ship. Because the night was so dark and because the target line happened to be altering course when sighted, all the destroyers fired at the same ship. Of the 32 torpedoes fired, 15 hit the leading ship and 1 in the next line. Now, with that being said, the number of torpedoes fired depended on the sensitivity of the torpedo pistol. The closer together that they would run, and the greater the chance the explosion of one would set off another's pistol. Torpedoes also did not run in that straight of a line, and with a lot running close together, it was likely that they would collide, something that would happen often in exercises. In June of 1933, arguments were made for either quadruple torpedo tubes or quintuple ones. Quadruple ones won because of what I previously said, but basically, if larger salvos could not be fired without torpedoes running into each other, why spend the extra money? A change for the machinery would see the elimination of cruising turbines, as there had been great effort put into increasing the endurance of destroyers since the First World War to match that of the capital ships that they would be accompanying, and with a meeting among the DNCS, ANCS, Director of Naval Plans, and DDT, they all agreed that a redesigned plant without cruising turbines would be able to achieve 4,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Like I mentioned in the introduction, the G-class would enjoy some export success, with 2 being built for Greece and 7 for Argentina as the Buenos Aires class, both being laid down in 1937. The Brazilians would order 6 modified versions of the class in 1938, and due to the Second World War breaking out, they would be purchased by the United Kingdom, becoming the Haven class. The G and H classes would only differ in the years that they would be laid down. Now, as for the design of the G class, they would displace around 1,400-ton standard displacement, and with the revised machinery, they would achieve a top speed of 35.5 knots. They would have a main battery of 4 4.7-inch guns with 2 turrets superfiring forward and 2 superfiring aft, along with 2 quadruple torpedo tubes and 2 quadruple 50 caliber machine gun mountings to serve as anti-aircraft weaponry, and 20 depth charges, with 1 rack and 2 throwers, along with ASDIC that would be later known as sonar. The G-class would be laid down in 1934, and most would be commissioned by 1936, and of the H-class, they would be laid down in 1935, and most were commissioned by 1936 as well. They would have destroyer flotilla leaders that would be slightly larger and carry an extra 4.7-inch mount. Some of the ships of the class would be experimental testbeds for new weapon systems, like HMS Glowworm with their quintuple torpedo mounts, or Hereward with their temporary twin 4.7-inch mount that would go on to be used in later classes of destroyers, like the Tribals. Some wartime modifications would be fit to this class, which due to their size required that any equipment brought onto the ship, an equally heavy piece had to be taken off, So, with the addition of more anti aircraft firepower, equally heavy equipment like torpedo tubes needed to be removed. As for naming conventions, each ship of their respective classes would be named after something starting with G or H, so names like Glowworm, Greyhound, Grenade, Griffin, or Hardy, Hasty, Hero, or Hunter. As for their service in the interwar period, they would mostly be stationed in the Mediterranean, assisting in neutrality patrols for the Spanish Civil War. With the outbreak of the Second World War, most were called back to the United Kingdom. Early in the war, they would serve in roles that would put them in harm's way, with some taking parts in the battles of Narvik in the Norwegian campaign, or like Glowworm when she took on the Admiral Hipper. More were sunk assisting in the evacuation of France. Of the remaining ships, some would return to the Mediterranean, fighting in major battles like the Battle of Calabria or Cape Matapan. The Havens would mostly see service in the North Atlantic, assisting in anti submarine patrols that would see half of their class sunk while doing so. By the end of 1943, a majority of the G and H class had been sunk, and some of the remaining ships would be transferred to the Royal Canadian Navy and would escort convoys in the North Atlantic. As for their service record, they would be fairly successful in sinking Axis craft in return for their own losses, notably submarines, destroyers, and aircraft. I hope you've enjoyed this look at a different destroyer type for the channel. Usually we've been covering larger destroyers like the Tribals or Battles, but I felt like changing it up here a bit and went for a smaller interwar design. Also, I wanted to take the time to address something. In the comments, I've been receiving requests for certain ships like USS Twigs or let's say Teget Hoff of Austria-Hungary. I'll eventually get to those ships, I just have a long list of others before getting there. Not to mention, researching those ships will be a challenge, as finding information on them seems to be rather difficult. But at the same time, I have not put in a ton of time looking into them, as I have a decently long list of things that I want to do first. Sorry about kind of ranting here, but I wanted to get off my chest in a video.